There are messages that arrive in your inbox and sit there quietly. And there are messages that reach through the screen and grab you by the throat. This one came from a man named Gerald, a retired linguist who spent 10 years mastering Tagalog so he could understand the Philippines from the inside. And what that language eventually revealed to him, whispered on a balcony he was never meant to overhear, is something no textbook and no dictionary could have ever prepared him for. I almost didn't read Gerald's message all the way through. It was long. It was detailed. It was written with the kind of precision you'd expect from a man who spent his career studying the architecture of words. But by the third paragraph, I had to put everything else aside. Because what Gerald described wasn't your typical story of a foreigner falling for a woman in Southeast Asia and losing his savings. This was something more unsettling. This was a man who did everything right, learned the language, studied the culture, lived in the country for years, and still walked directly into the trap that was built specifically around the thing he trusted most, his own understanding. I'm not going to tell you how Gerald's story ends. Not yet. But I will tell you this. By the time you hear what his Filipina partner said about him when she thought he couldn't understand, you'll realize that the most dangerous lies aren't the ones spoken in a language you don't know. They're the ones spoken in a language you're absolutely certain you do. This is Gerald's story. And if it doesn't change how you think about trust, language, and love in Southeast Asia, nothing will. If you've been enjoying the stories I tell, please consider hitting the subscribe button. Your support is crucial for the growth of this channel and helps me dedicate time to making these videos despite my commitment to a full-time job. Thank you for being here. My name is Gerald Henriksen, and I need you to understand something about me before I tell you what happened, because without that context, you'll think I was just another foolish old foreigner chasing a young woman in the Philippines. I wasn't, or at least that's not all I was. I was born in Oslo, Norway. My parents moved to Minnesota when I was 9 years old. I grew up in Duluth, on the shores of Lake Superior, in a house where my father spoke Norwegian at dinner, and my mother answered in English, and nobody thought that was strange. Languages were the family currency. By the time I finished high school, I spoke Norwegian, English, and passable German. By the time I finished my linguistics degree at the University of Minnesota, I'd added French and Spanish. But the languages that changed my life, the ones that pulled me out of academia and into the real world, were the ones I learned in Southeast Asia. I spent nearly a decade working for an NGO based in Minneapolis that ran literacy programs across Cambodia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. My job was field linguistics, going into communities, learning local languages and dialects, helping design educational materials that actually made sense to the people using them. It was the best work I ever did. Not because of the pay, which was modest, but because every new language felt like a door opening into a room I'd never known existed. In Cambodia, I learned enough Khmer to read children's books aloud to classrooms full of kids who laughed at my pronunciation. In Vietnam, I picked up conversational Vietnamese in a small town outside Hue, where the locals taught me slang in exchange for English lessons. But it was the Philippines where I truly fell in love with the country, with the culture, and eventually with the language that would one day break my heart. I learned Tagalog first because it was practical. Then I learned Cebuano because I was stationed in the Visayas for 2 years and wanted to understand the people around me, not just communicate with them. I picked up basic Ilocano from a colleague who was from Laog. By the time my posting ended, I could argue with jeepney drivers about fares, joke with market vendors about the price of mangoes, and read Jose Rizal in the original Filipino. I wasn't just a foreigner who'd memorized phrases from a guidebook. I had spent years inside the language, understanding its rhythms, its humor, its silences. The way Filipinos code switch between Tagalog and their regional language when they want to say something private in a crowded room. I understood that code switching. I could follow it. And that understanding, that hard-earned fluency, became the foundation of every decision I made when I returned to the Philippines years later. It was also the thing that destroyed me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before the Philippines, before Marisol, before any of this, there was Linda, my wife. We married when I was 28 and she was 26. She was a school teacher in Duluth, a woman who read novels in bed every night and left her reading glasses in a different room every morning, and never once complained about the months I spent overseas for work. We had 2 sons, Kyle, who's 34 now, and works in logistics in Chicago, Marcus, who's 30 and lives in Portland, doing something in tech that I've never fully understood. Linda was my anchor, not in the dramatic, romantic way people talk about in movies, but in the quiet, structural way. She was the reason I could fly to the other side of the world and know there was a home waiting for me when I came back. Linda was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer when she was 51. She was gone within 8 months. I described losing her once, in an essay I never published, as the day the subtitles disappeared from my life. That's what it felt like. Like I was still watching the same movie, but I could no longer understand what anyone was saying or why any of it mattered. The boys were already grown and gone by then. Kyle called once a month out of obligation. A 15-minute conversation that followed the same script every time. Work, weather, anything else. Okay, talk to you next month, Dad. Marcus stopped visiting altogether. Not out of cruelty, he just didn't know how to sit in a room with a grieving man and find words that meant anything. I didn't blame either of them. They'd lost their mother. I'd lost my translator, the person who made the world make sense. For 7 years after Linda died, I existed. That's the most accurate word. I freelanced as a translator, picking up contracts from academic publishers and NGOs that needed documents converted between English and various Southeast Asian languages. I taught part-time at a community college introductory linguistics, 2 sections a semester, mostly students who were there to fulfill a requirement and spent the lectures looking at their phones. I lived in the same house Linda and I had shared, surrounded by her books and her reading glasses and the ghost of a life that no longer generated new memories. I had approximately $140,000 in savings, most of it from Linda's life insurance. My monthly income from freelancing and teaching was around $3,200. Not wealthy, not poor. Just enough to be comfortable in Duluth, where comfort doesn't cost much. But I wasn't comfortable. I was disappearing, becoming invisible the way older men do when they stop being useful to anyone. No wife to take care of, no children who needed guidance, no career that required my presence. I was becoming furniture in my own life. That's why I went back to the Philippines, not to find a woman, not to retire on a beach, not to chase the fantasy that so many Western men chase when they land in Manila with a suitcase full of expectations and a wallet they think makes them interesting. I went back because the Philippines was the last place I remembered feeling alive. The last place where I'd woken up in the morning curious about what the day would bring. I chose Dumaguete specifically because it wasn't Angeles City or Cebu or any of the places where foreign men go to be surrounded by attention they mistake for affection. Dumaguete was a university town, quiet and literary. Known for Silliman University and its old American colonial architecture and its boulevard where people walked in the evenings and ate corn from street vendors and watched the sun go down over the Bohol Sea. I thought, and this is the kind of thought that feels wise at the time and idiotic in retrospect, that Dumaguete would attract a different kind of connection, a more genuine one, a more intellectual one. I rented a modest apartment near the university. I started freelancing from there, keeping my American clients while enjoying the lower cost of living. I walked the boulevard every evening. I drank coffee at a small bookstore cafe near campus. I spoke Tagalog everywhere I went, not to impress anyone, just because it was natural after all those years. The vendors at the local market were surprised. At first, then delighted. They'd switch from their practice tourist English to rapid Bisaya Tagalog mix, testing me, and I'd follow along, and they'd laugh and call me kuya and give me extra silly with my barbecue. For the first time in years, I felt like I existed inside a world rather than watching it through glass. It was at the bookstore cafe where I met Marisol. She was working part-time as a cashier. Mid-30s, though she looked younger. Not the kind of woman who turns heads from across the room, not conventionally glamorous. not dressed to attract attention. But there was something about the way she carried herself. Composed, serious, like someone who had been through difficult things and had decided that dignity was the only response she could afford. She had high cheekbones, deep brown eyes, and a smile that appeared rarely enough to feel earned when it arrived. I ordered my coffee in Tagalog. Nothing dramatic, just the normal way I ordered everything in Dumaguete. But her reaction told me this wasn't normal for her. She looked up from the register, surprised, and asked me in Tagalog where I'd learned to speak it. I told her I'd worked in the Philippines for years. She asked where. I told her about the NGO, the literacy programs, the years in the Visayas. She was interested genuinely, not performatively. She asked follow-up questions. She wanted to know which dialects I'd learned, how long it had taken, whether I could understand Bisaya. I told her I could, conversationally. She said most foreigners in Dumaguete could barely order a San Miguel in English without pointing. I noticed the book she'd been reading during her break, a Tagalog translation of a Paulo Coelho novel tucked under the counter. I asked her about it. She was embarrassed. She thought Coelho was probably too simple for a linguist. I told her that Coelho was actually more honest in Tagalog than in English, that the directness of the language stripped away the pretension and left something more genuine underneath. She laughed. A real laugh, not a polite one. It was the first time I'd made a woman laugh since Linda. I came back the next day, and the day after that. Within 2 weeks, I was having coffee at that cafe every afternoon during Marisol's break. We talked about books, about languages, about her life in Dumaguete, about my work. She was smart in a way that formal education hadn't shaped, intuitive, observant, with a sharp sense of humor that she deployed carefully, as if she'd learned that being too clever could be dangerous. I found myself looking forward to those afternoon conversations with an intensity that surprised me. There's something I need to explain here, because it matters to everything that comes later. When Marisol and I spoke, we spoke in Tagalog, my Tagalog, careful, grammatically sound, conversationally fluent. What Marisol didn't know, what I never explicitly told her, was that my comprehension went far deeper than my speaking suggested. I could follow rapid, colloquial Tagalog. I could understand the Bisaya Tagalog code switching that Visayan Filipinos use instinctively when they're speaking among themselves and don't think anyone else is listening. I could catch slang, sarcasm, double meanings, the tonal shifts that signal when someone is joking versus when they're serious. I didn't hide this on purpose, not at first. It simply never came up in conversation. Marisol heard me speak Tagalog at the level I spoke it, and she assumed that was the ceiling. She assumed my understanding stopped where my accent started. That assumption was wrong, and it would eventually unravel everything between us. After about a month of afternoon coffees, I asked Marisol to dinner. She accepted, but she insisted on choosing the restaurant, a modest place near the public market that served local food and charged local prices. This impressed me. I'd been in Southeast Asia long enough to recognize the difference between a woman who wants to be seen at an expensive restaurant with a foreigner and a woman who is uncomfortable with that dynamic. Marisol seemed uncomfortable. She ordered economically. She tried to split the bill. I didn't let her, but the attempt mattered to me. Over dinner, she told me about her life. She'd grown up in Tanjay, about 40 minutes north of Dumaguete. Her family had been sugarcane farmers, modest, hard-working people who lost their lease when a corporation bought the plantation. By 17, she was working as a sales clerk in a mall. By 21, she'd married a local man named Ronaldo, a tricycle driver. The marriage had been a disaster. Ronaldo was violent and unfaithful. They separated but never legally annulled. She explained that annulment in the Philippines was expensive and slow, a process that could take years and cost thousands of dollars that she didn't have. She had one daughter, Amara, 7 years old, who lived with Marisol's parents in Tanjay because Marisol couldn't afford to care for her on a cashier's salary in Dumaguete. When she talked about Amara, Marisol cried. Not dramatically, not for effect. Her voice just cracked, and her eyes filled, and she wiped them quickly with the back of her hand as if embarrassed that the emotion had escaped. I told her about Linda, about the cancer, about the 8 months, about the silence that followed. I cried too. It was the first time I'd cried in front of another person since Linda's funeral. The intimacy of that shared grief accelerated everything. Within weeks, we were seeing each other every day. Not just at the cafe, she'd come to my apartment in the evenings. We'd cook together, watch movies, talk for hours. The chemistry was real, at least on my end. For the first time since Linda, I felt something other than the steady hum of loss that had become the background frequency of my life. I felt desire. I felt curiosity. I felt the particular warmth that comes from being known by someone specific, not generically appreciated, but specifically understood. Marisol moved in with me during the 5th month. I asked her about formalizing our relationship, and she said she wanted that more than anything but needed to finalize the annulment from Ronaldo first. She'd already started the process, she said. She had a lawyer in Dumaguete who was handling the paperwork. It would take time and money, but once it was done, she'd be free. I told her I'd help with the legal fees. She resisted at first, or seemed to resist, which is not the same thing, though I didn't understand that distinction at the time. The financial support started gradually, the way these things always do. Amara needed tuition for her private school, $600 per semester. Marisol's parents needed monthly help, $400 to keep the household running now that the farm income was gone. The annulment lawyer needed payments a few hundred here, a few hundred there, eventually totaling around $2,000 over several months. Each request came wrapped in reluctance. Marisol would bring up the expense hesitantly, always emphasizing that she hated asking, always offering alternatives that she clearly knew were impractical. And I'd step in, because stepping in felt right. It felt like what a good partner does. It felt like what a man who wants to build a life with a woman and her child does. I was happy. Genuinely happy. In a way I'd forgotten I could be. I woke up in the morning with a reason to get dressed that wasn't obligation. I started writing again personal essays about language and identity and second chances, the kind of writing I'd abandoned after Linda died because the words had stopped meaning anything. The Philippines had given me back my voice, and Marisol had given me back my audience. I told Kyle and Marcus about her. Kyle said nothing, which was Kyle's way of saying everything. Marcus said, "Be careful, Dad." I heard what I wanted to hear. I heard "be happy." The months with Marisol settled into a rhythm that felt, from the inside, like domesticity. She cooked breakfast while I worked on translations at my desk. We'd walk to the market together in the late afternoon, where she'd haggle in rapid Bisaya over the price of bangus, and I'd carry the bags and feel useful. Evenings were quiet dinner, conversation, the sound of the boulevard through the open windows. She'd tell me about her day, about her conversations with the other cashiers, about Amara's progress in school. I'd tell her about whatever translation project I was working on, or read her passages from essays I was drafting. She'd listen, with what seemed like genuine interest, asking questions, offering opinions that were sometimes sharper and more insightful than anything I'd hear from my students back in Duluth. There were small things that bothered me not enough to investigate, just enough to register. Marisol's phone was always face down on the table. She took calls in the other room, usually in rapid Bisaya that she assumed I couldn't fully follow. The annulment process seemed to involve an unusual number of delays, new paperwork needed, court dates rescheduled, additional fees required. Every month or so, a family emergency would surface that required somewhere between $500 and $1,000. Her mother needed medication, her father's back pain required treatment, her sister Lorna's husband had lost his job. Each emergency was plausible on its own. It was only in aggregate that the pattern should have been visible. But I wasn't looking at the aggregate. I was looking at the woman next to me who made me feel less alone, and I was choosing, every single day, to trust her. There was one evening I remember it clearly because it was the first time something felt genuinely wrong. Not just odd when Marisol came home from visiting Amara in Tanjay and seemed shaken in a way that her usual family trips never produced. Her eyes were red, Not from crying, but from the kind of controlled tension that settles into a person's face when they've been arguing for hours and have resolved nothing. I asked her what was wrong. She said her mother's blood pressure was high again, and they'd had a disagreement about treatment options. I accepted that. It was a reasonable explanation. What I didn't know was that Ronaldo had shown up at her parents' house that afternoon, demanding money, threatening to file for full custody of Amara if Marisol didn't cover his latest gambling debt. Lorna had called Marisol in advance to warn her, and the two of them had spent the visit managing Ronaldo, paying him enough to leave, promising more next month, keeping the entire crisis invisible to me. The redness in Marisol's eyes wasn't from a disagreement about her mother's blood pressure. It was from the exhaustion of maintaining two separate realities at once, one for Ronaldo and Lorna and the machinery of survival, and one for me and the fiction of a stable, honest partnership. I should explain something about the financial picture, because it matters. I wasn't a wealthy man by any standard. My savings from Linda's insurance were being slowly but steadily consumed. I tracked every expense in a spreadsheet, the linguist's habit of cataloging data, but I filed the payments to Marisol and her family under a mental category. I labeled investment in our future, monthly. Support to Marisol herself, a few hundred here, small gifts there. Amara's tuition, inflated beyond what I would later learn the actual cost to be. The family support, the annulment fees, the emergencies. It all added up, but it added up slowly enough that I could look at any individual expense and tell myself it was reasonable. It was only when I eventually totaled everything much later, in a very different state of mind, that the number would make me physically ill. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing from inside the warm fog of my own contentment, was that Ronaldo had never left the picture. He lived 20 minutes away in Tangier. He and Marisol still communicated regularly. The annulment had never been filed. There was no lawyer, no paperwork, no court dates. The money I'd been sending for legal fees was being used to pay off Ronaldo's gambling debts because Ronaldo had leverage. He was Amara's father, and in the Philippines, family courts tend to favor biological parents. And Ronaldo used that threat like a blade held to Marisol's throat. Pay what I owe, or I take the child. The family emergencies were real, in the sense that the family did need money, but the amounts were systematically inflated by about 40%, with the excess managed by Marisol's older sister Lorna, who functioned as the family's financial strategist. Lorna decided where the extra money went, some to Ronaldo's debts, some to the family's actual needs, some to a small fund that Lorna called insurance, which really meant savings for the next time Ronaldo showed up demanding payment. I knew none of this. I knew coffee in the morning and walks along the boulevard, and the sound of Marisol's laugh when I mispronounced a Bisaya word on purpose to amuse her. I knew the weight of her head on my shoulder in the evenings, and the particular way she said, "Mahal kita." I love you with a softness that I believed, with every cell in my body, was genuine. It was a Tuesday in the 9th month. I remember the day precisely because I'd been expecting a large translation file from a client in Minneapolis, and when the deadline was pushed back, I decided to come home early and surprise Marisol with lunch. I picked up pancit from our favorite carinderia and walked back to the apartment, feeling the simple pleasure of an unexpected free afternoon with the woman I loved. I opened the apartment door quietly. Not sneaking, just moving naturally, the way you do when you're in your own home. I heard Marisol's voice coming from the balcony. She was on the phone. I was about to call out to her when I caught the tone of the conversation rapid, intense, the kind of Tagalog Bisaya mix that Filipinos use when they're deep in a conversation they don't want overheard. And something in that tone made me stop. Something made me set the food down on the kitchen counter without making a sound and stand very still in the hallway, just out of sight of the balcony door. She was talking to Lorna. I recognized Lorna's speaking rhythm from the few times I'd met her. A sharp, pragmatic voice that cut through pleasantries the way a machete cuts through cane. Marisol was speaking in a stream I could follow almost perfectly, my comprehension clicking into a gear she'd never known existed. The first thing I heard clearly was a phrase that landed like a stone in my chest. Marisol called me Ang Matanda, the old man. She said it casually, the way you'd refer to a household fixture, not with malice, but without affection either. Just a label. The old man. Then she said something that I will remember for the rest of my life in a language I will never be able to unhear. She said in Tagalog, "He's easy. He thinks because he speaks Tagalog, he understands everything. That's what makes him the easiest. He thinks he's smart." Lorna laughed on the other end of the phone. I could hear it through the balcony door, thin and sharp. Marisol kept talking. The annulment money was going to Ronaldo, she confirmed. He wanted more. He always wanted more. She told Lorna she would tell me there was a court delay and request another $1,500 next month. She described the excuse she'd use something about additional documentation fees, a bribe to expedite the process, the kind of detail that sounds convincing when you want to believe it. She was rehearsing the lie in real time, polishing it for delivery, and I was standing 3 meters away understanding every word. Then the conversation shifted to something I hadn't anticipated. Lorna asked about the motorcycle, the one that had been purchased 3 months earlier during what Marisol told me was a medical emergency involving her father's hospitalization. Marisol confirmed that Ronaldo had registered it under his name and was using it for a delivery side job that was generating modest income. Lorna wanted to know if they could leverage that income to reduce the amount they needed from me each month. Marisol said no, if the requests decreased, I might start asking questions. Better to keep everything steady, predictable, unremarkable. She used a word I recognized from business Tagalog, consistente. Consistent. She was managing me the way a competent employee manages an unpredictable client. Keep the deliverables smooth, keep the invoices regular, and never give them a reason to audit the books. And then she said the thing that broke something in me that I don't have a word for in any of the languages I speak. She said, "Mahal ko siya, in a way pero yung pera ang importante. Wala tayong choice." I love him in a way, but the money is what matters. We don't have a choice. I stood in that hallway for a very long time. I don't know how long. The pancit got cold on the counter. My hands were shaking, but not from anger. From something worse than anger. From the realization that the one thing I had trusted above everything else, my understanding of the language, my ability to hear the truth beneath the words, my belief that fluency was a kind of armor, was exactly the weakness she'd been exploiting from the beginning. She hadn't lied to me in a language I didn't understand. She had lied to me in a language I understood perfectly. She just waited until she was speaking to someone else to tell the truth in it. I didn't confront her that day. A different man would have. A different man would have walked onto that balcony and demanded answers while the phone was still in her hand. But I am not that kind of man. I have spent my entire adult life studying languages. And what that teaches you, above all else, is patience. The willingness to listen before you speak. The discipline to gather all the data before you construct the sentence. So I gathered data. Over the next 3 months, I became the linguist of my own betrayal. I investigated quietly, methodically, with the same attention to detail I'd once applied to documenting endangered dialects in remote Philippine provinces. I checked receipts. I visited the lawyer's office where the annulment was supposedly being processed. It was a real office, a real practice. But when I asked the receptionist if there was a case filed under Marisol's name, she checked and shook her head. No record. I found Ronaldo's Facebook profile. It was active, updated regularly, full of recent photos, including photos with Amara, taken at what appeared to be family gatherings that Marisol had told me she'd attended alone. The motorcycle, I'd been told, was a family emergency. I traced the registration. It was in Ronaldo's name. There was a particular afternoon during this investigation period that nearly broke my resolve to stay silent. I had gone to the municipal hall to check public records related to the supposed annulment filing, and the clerk, a young woman who clearly dealt with foreigners asking similar questions more often than anyone would want to admit, looked at me with an expression that wasn't pity exactly, but something adjacent to it, she said in Bisaya to her colleague behind the partition, assuming I couldn't understand. Another one. They always come looking. Her colleague murmured something I couldn't catch, and they both returned to their work. I stood there holding my folder of printed receipts and fabricated legal correspondence, and for the first time, I considered the possibility that I was not a unique case, that I was a type, that somewhere in a municipal office in Dumaguete there was an unwritten category for men like me, foreign, educated, certain of their own sophistication, who arrived at the records window carrying the same confusion and the same carefully organized paperwork and the same refusal to believe what the empty filing cabinet was already telling them. I built a spreadsheet, column by column. I documented every financial transaction I'd made on behalf of Marisol and her family over the course of our relationship. I cross-referenced what she'd told me with what I could verify independently. The school tuition was real. Amara did attend a private school, but the amount Marisol quoted was roughly 40% higher than the actual fees. The family monthly support was genuine in destination, but inflated in amount. The annulment fees were entirely fabricated. The emergency expenses were a mix of real needs and invented crises, managed by Lorna with the strategic precision of someone who had been doing this for a long time. The total came to approximately $44,000. I stared at that number for a long time. $44,000. Nearly a third of everything Linda's death had left me, gone not into the black hole of an obvious scam, not into the pockets of a stranger I'd met on the internet, but into the carefully maintained fiction of a woman who slept next to me every night and said "Mahal kita" every morning and meant it just enough to make it convincing. The night I confronted her, I cooked dinner. Her favorite adobo, the way she'd taught me to make it, with the vinegar reduced until it was almost syrup and the garlic browned but not burnt. We ate together. We talked about ordinary things. She told me about her day at the cafe. I told her about a translation project. We cleared the dishes, and then, as she sat down on the sofa with her phone, the phone that was always face down, always locked, always taken to another room for calls, I sat across from her and began to speak. I spoke in Tagalog, not the careful accented Tagalog she was used to hearing from me. Full Tagalog. Fluid, precise, and fast. I used Bisaya phrases she'd only ever used with her family. The colloquial expressions, the slang, the code switches she deployed when she thought no foreigner in the room could follow. Her face changed immediately. The color drained from it in a way that was almost medical, like watching someone receive a diagnosis. She knew. In the space between one sentence and the next, she understood that I had understood everything, possibly for a very long time. I recounted the phone call, word for word. I told her what she'd said about me to Lorna. I repeated the phrase, "Ang matanda," the old man, and watched her flinch. I told her I knew about Ronaldo. I told her I knew the annulment was a fiction. I told her I knew about the motorcycle, the inflated tuition, the manufactured emergencies, the 40% surcharge on every crisis. I showed her the spreadsheet. $44,000, itemized, categorized, documented with the same meticulous precision I'd once applied to recording verb conjugations in dying languages. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I spoke with the calm of a man delivering a lecture on a subject he has studied exhaustively. The subject, in this case, being his own destruction. And Marisol, to her credit, or perhaps to her final act of honesty, did not deny any of it. She broke down. She cried the way she cried that first night at dinner when she told me about Amara, except this time the tears weren't a bridge to intimacy. They were the sound of a wall collapsing. She told me she was sorry. She told me she loved me. She said both things were true at the same time. And the devastating thing, the thing that made the whole experience worse than a clean betrayal by a stranger, was that I believed her on both counts. Marisol was not a professional con artist. She was not part of a syndicate. She was a woman from a sugarcane family that had lost everything, trapped between a violent ex-husband who used their daughter as leverage, a dependent extended family that looked to her as the one with access to a foreigner's money, and a man she genuinely cared for but had been lying to since the day their relationship became financial. She loved me in a way, her own words, spoken to her sister when she thought I couldn't understand. But the money was what mattered. And she was right about one thing. She didn't have a choice. Or she believed she didn't, which in the end amounts to the same thing. I asked her to leave. She did. She packed a small bag and called a tricycle and left without arguing, without pleading, without the dramatic scene that I'd half expected and half dreaded. The apartment was very quiet after she went. I sat on the sofa where she'd been sitting, in a room that still smelled like the adobo we'd shared, and I was surrounded by two languages and no one to speak either of them to. I called Marcus that night. It was morning in Portland, and he answered on the second ring, probably because I never called. I told him what had happened. Not all of it. I spared him the spreadsheet and the specific amounts, but enough. For the first time in Marcus's adult life, he heard his father cry. There was a long silence on the line. Then Marcus said, "Come home, Dad." 2 words. In English. The simplest language I know. And in that moment, the only one that mattered. I didn't leave Dumaguete immediately. I should have. There was no logical reason to stay. But I stayed for another 2 months, walking the same streets I'd walked with Marisol, sitting in the same cafe where we'd met, ordering coffee in Tagalog from a new cashier who didn't know my name or my story. I went to the boulevard every evening and watched the same sunset over the same sea and felt the absence of the person who used to stand next to me like a phantom limb, something that wasn't there but still ached. During those 2 months, I ran into Marisol once. It was unplanned. I was walking back from the market and she was crossing the street near the cathedral carrying a bag of groceries. She saw me before I could avoid her. We stood on opposite sides of the road for a moment that felt much longer than it was. She looked thinner, tired. She raised her hand, not a wave, exactly, more like a gesture of acknowledgement. The way you'd greet someone you owe a debt to that you both know will never be repaid. I nodded. She turned and walked away. I stood there watching her disappear around the corner, and I thought about the first time I'd seen her at the cafe, reading Coelho during her break, and how I'd told her the book was more honest in Tagalog than in English. The irony of that sentence has never stopped burning. I was trying to understand something during those final weeks. Not Marisol, I understood Marisol, probably better than she understood herself. I was trying to understand how a man could spend 10 years learning a language, could read its literature and speak its slang and understand its silences, and still be so completely deceived by someone speaking it. I'd built my entire identity around the idea that language was a bridge, that if you learned to speak someone's words, you could access their world, their truth, their intentions. What I'd discovered, standing in that hallway, was that language isn't a bridge at all. It's a road, and roads go in both directions. The same Tagalog that let me into Marisol's world, let her build a world specifically designed to keep me inside it. I returned to Duluth in the spring. The apartment felt smaller than I remembered, though nothing had changed. My savings were down to approximately $96,000, enough to survive on, in combination with freelance work and my adjunct salary, but not enough to feel secure, not enough to feel like the years ahead were covered. Linda's life insurance, which was supposed to fund a modest retirement, had been reduced by nearly a third. The money was gone, and it wasn't coming back. And I had no one to blame but myself and a woman who'd told her sister the truth about me in a language she never expected me to understand. I stopped freelancing. I stopped teaching. Not immediately, it happened gradually, the way things end when the energy that sustained them is no longer there. I'd sit at my desk in the morning intending to work on a translation and find myself staring at the screen, unable to concentrate, unable to care whether the English verb matched the Tagalog verb, because what did it matter? What did any of it matter when the whole premise of my professional life that language connects people to truth had been dismantled by a 6-minute phone call on a balcony in Dumaguete? The isolation was the worst part. Not because I was alone. I'd been alone before, after Linda, and I knew how to survive solitude. The isolation was different this time because it came with shame. I couldn't tell anyone the full story without hearing how it sounded. A 58-year-old American man falls for a younger Filipina woman, sends her money, gets deceived. The narrative writes itself, and in that narrative, I'm the fool. It doesn't matter that I spoke the language. It doesn't matter that I lived in the country. It doesn't matter that I did everything the advice columns and the expat forums say you should do: learn the culture, avoid the tourist traps, build genuine connections in university towns instead of bar districts. None of that matters, because the ending is the same. I lost the money. I lost the woman. I lost the version of myself that believed understanding could protect me. Kyle called 1 month after I returned. The same 15-minute script as always: work, weather, anything else. But at the end, he paused and said, "Marcus told me about the Philippines, Dad." I'm sorry. It was the most emotional thing Kyle had ever said to me. And it wasn't emotional at all by most people's standards, but from Kyle it was an earthquake. I thanked him. He said okay and hung up. Marcus called more frequently after that, once a week instead of once a month, and the conversations were different, less dutiful, more real. He asked questions. He listened. He didn't offer advice, which was exactly the right instinct. What I needed wasn't someone to tell me what I should have done differently. I needed someone to sit in the silence with me while I figured out how to live with what I hadn't done. I wrote one final essay about a man who learned a language so well he could hear his own destruction in it, about the difference between understanding words and understanding people, about the arrogance of believing that fluency in someone's language grants fluency in their intentions. I wrote it in English, and when I finished, I translated it into Tagalog, not because anyone would read it in Tagalog, but because I needed to prove to myself that the language still belonged to me, that what Marisol had done hadn't stolen it from me the way Ronaldo had stolen her choices, or the way cancer had stolen Linda. I submitted the essay to no one. It sits on my laptop, in 2 languages, read by no one. Maybe it always will. Or maybe it's the thing I'm submitting now, reformatted as a warning, to a channel that tells stories like mine, so that other men might recognize the shape of their own deception before it's too late. I need to say something about Marisol that might make some of you uncomfortable. She was not evil. I've had a long time to think about this, and I've come to a conclusion that I stand by even though it makes my own story harder to tell. Marisol was a woman caught between impossible pressures, a violent ex-husband who used their daughter as a weapon, a family that depended on her access to a foreigner's money, a culture in which the eldest responsible daughter is expected to carry everyone and never complain. She lied to me, systematically and deliberately, for nearly a year. She inflated expenses. She fabricated legal proceedings. She redirected my money to a man who had beaten her and gambled away everything and then demanded more. She did all of this while sharing my bed, cooking my meals, laughing at my jokes, and telling me she loved me. And I genuinely believe that part of her did love me. Not enough to tell me the truth, but enough that it cost her something to lie. That doesn't excuse what she did. It doesn't make the $44,000 any less gone. It doesn't undo the damage to my savings or my self-respect or my ability to trust another human being. But it makes the story more than a simple cautionary tale about foreign men and Southeast Asian women. It makes it a story about what poverty does to honesty, about how desperation creates its own moral framework where lies become survival tools and love becomes a currency you spend rather than a feeling you protect. I love him in a way, but the money is what matters. We don't have a choice. That sentence haunts me. Not because it's cruel, because it's true. For Marisol, love and money were never separate categories. They couldn't be. In a life where every relationship is an economic negotiation with Ronaldo, with her family, with the systems that kept her trapped, affection that doesn't generate income is a luxury she couldn't afford. I was the person she was most honest with, except about the one thing that mattered most. And the tragedy is that if she'd told me the truth about Ronaldo, about the debts, about Lorna's financial management, I might have helped her anyway. I might have found a way to address the real problems instead of funding the fictions built on top of them. But she couldn't know that because every man who'd ever been in her life had taught her that honesty was a risk she couldn't take. I'm telling you this not to excuse Marisol, but to warn you that the real world is more complicated than the categories we use to describe it. Not every woman in Southeast Asia who takes money from a foreigner is a villain. Not every foreigner who sends money is a fool. The reality is messier, sadder, and more human than any simple narrative allows. But that messiness doesn't protect you from the consequences. You can understand a person's motivations completely and still lose $44,000 and your belief in your own judgment. If you're a foreigner in Southeast Asia and you've met someone who makes you, I feel alive for the first time in years, listen to me carefully. I was not a naive tourist. I spoke the language. I knew the culture. I'd lived in the country. I did everything right, and I still got it wrong. Because the thing I didn't understand, the thing that no amount of linguistic fluency can teach you, is that a person can love you and lie to you at the same time. They can mean every word they say to your face, and every word they say behind your back. They can cry real tears when they tell you about their struggles, and still inflate the cost of those struggles by 40%. Human beings are not dictionaries. You can't look up their real meaning by learning their language. So here's what I'll tell you from the other side of this. Trust, but verify. And I don't mean that as a cute proverb. I mean literally verify. If there's a legal process, visit the lawyer's office yourself. If there's a tuition payment, see the school bill with your own eyes. If there's a family emergency that requires money, ask to speak with the doctor or see the invoice. Any honest partner will understand why you're asking. Any partner who's offended by verification is a partner who has something to hide. And if you speak the language, if you've done what I did and invested years in learning Tagalog or Thai or Vietnamese or Khmer, don't let that fluency become arrogance. The language won't protect you. It never did. Speaking someone's words doesn't mean you speak their truth. Understanding the vocabulary doesn't mean you understand the person. I could conjugate every verb in Tagalog, and it didn't help me see what was right in front of me because the problem was never linguistic. The problem was emotional. I wanted to believe, and wanting to believe is a universal language that has no dictionary and no grammar and no defense. I'm 61 years old now. I live in Duluth. I walk along Lake Superior the way I used to walk along the boulevard in Dumaguete, except the water is colder and nobody sells corn on the shore, and the sunsets go down over iron-colored waves instead of a blue sea. I'm dating someone local, a woman I met through a former colleague, a librarian who speaks nothing but English and doesn't need a spreadsheet to verify. It's quieter than what I had with Marisol. Less exciting. But quiet has its own vocabulary, and I'm learning to trust it. My savings will recover. Slowly. My relationship with Marcus has improved in ways I didn't expect. Something about vulnerability opened a door between us that obligation never could. Kyle still calls once a month, but now he asks how I'm doing and waits for the answer. I don't teach anymore, but I still translate. Last month, I worked on a document for a nonprofit that assists Filipino women escaping domestic violence. The irony wasn't lost on me. Neither was the purpose. I think about Marisol sometimes. Not with anger. Anger requires an energy I no longer have for her. I think about her with the kind of sadness that has no resolution. The kind that just sits in you like a word you know the meaning of but can't quite pronounce. I hope Amara is doing well in school. I hope Ronaldo has disappeared for good. I hope Marisol found someone, or something, that lets her be honest. I doubt it, but I hope. My name is Gerald Henriksen. I spent 10 years learning Tagalog. I could read Rizal in the original. I could argue with jeepney drivers in Cebuano. I could order street food in Ilocano and make the vendor laugh. I thought language was a skeleton key that if I could speak it, I could see through it. I was wrong. Marisol didn't lie to me in a language I didn't understand. She lied to me in a language I understood perfectly, just not when she was speaking to someone else. The day I stood in that hallway and heard her call me Ang Matanda, the old man in the same Tagalog I'd used to tell her I loved her, something broke that no language has a word for. If you're a foreigner in the Philippines and you speak Tagalog, don't let that fluency become arrogance. The language won't protect you. It never did. The only thing it guarantees is that when the truth finally arrives, you'll understand it clearly enough to feel every syllable. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think twice about something or someone, then Gerald's pain has purpose. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story. They don't get easier, but they might save you from learning the lesson the way Gerald did in a language you trusted, from a person you loved, in a hallway you were never meant to be standing in.